Born in London, in Camden town, 1923. Went to the Lyle Stanley School, and as part of the schooling we took German. So I went to Germany before the war, and I saw Hermann Göring arriving at Cologne railway station, and the brown shirts and the Hitler Jugend. And when I arrived home, I said to my parents, there's trouble coming, and trouble did come. And so at the start of the war, I had enrolled as a messenger boy with the London Fire Brigade, and I went through the London Blitz. And then at Oakley Square, I saw a man digging at the ruin of a house. His mother was inside, and he was doing it with his bare hands. And I thought, we need something active to put an end to this. So I joined the Air Force and became an air gunner.
Amazing. So what year, what did you do?
I joined the Air Force in 1941. I spent my 18th birthday in the Air Force. My father was in the Royal Flying Corps, so it seemed natural to join the Air Force.
How quickly was it possible for you to actually be flying on operation?
Well, it was, when I went through the aircrew selection, they said, OK, pilot, and I said, right. And they said, go away, we'll send for you. How long? 18 months. The Empire Air Training Scheme didn't exist at that time. And I thought, by the time that goes round and I do a year's training as pilot, the war will be over. The same thing applied for navigator. And then they said, if you come in as an air gunner, you'll go straight on your course. So a year later, having done every job there is to be done to keep an aeroplane up in the air, short of getting near one, I went on the gunnery course. It did me good that year. It made me realise that a hell of a lot of people have to do a whole lot of things to keep an aeroplane up in the air. And then I was posted to 150 Squadron, Wellington's, Snaith near Doncaster, and we flew an aircraft Z for Zebra, modified to carry a 4,000-pound bomb. It didn't have bomb doors or anything, there was just a big hole. And we always took off last in case anything happened, and we blew the place to pieces. And on the 16th of September 42, we were on Essen, and we were carrying that night a second pilot with us, Del Mounts, an American in the Canadian Air Force, flying with us to gain experience before taking his own crew. It was his first op. And we approached the target, and about 20 miles from the target, the aircraft was hit by anti-aircraft fire, and the port engine was put out. So we pressed on for the odd few miles, dropped the bomb where it was meant to be, and tried to make for the coast on the other engine. But over Belgium, the other engine failed, and we had to bail out. And we were at about 13,000 feet at that time. And I came through a cloud, which was rather cold and wet, and I was feeling annoyed. It was a Wednesday, Thursday night. We were due to go and leave on the Friday, and I wasn't at all happy. And then the ground came up and hit me. Large Belgian field, ploughed fortunately. So I buried my parachute, and whilst at gunnery school, another chappie there, a cadet, Ray, we were both Londoners, had discussed, what do you do if you get shot down? Go to Switzerland, it seemed too obvious. Try to make for Sweden, a neutral country. Well, in the winter time, we didn't think you would survive. Cross the Channel, totally impossible. We knew that both sides would be heavily defended, and we'd already had experience of Dad's army when we'd crashed an aircraft in this country and had to convince them in good Anglo-Saxon that we were on their side because their bayonets were in our ribs. They didn't know whose side we were on. So the other place to go to seemed to be Spain. And so using a bit of astronav, the good old Polestar, I set off, hopefully, for the southwest and to try and get to Spain. in the morning, early in the morning, I came to a village which I found to be Capellan by Glabeek, and I looked around the village, and as the light was coming up, and just on the outskirts of the village there was a farmhouse on a rise, and I liked the look of it, so I went and knocked on the door, hoping that a very elderly lady would answer, and if she wasn't friendly I could run faster than she could. Instead of which a burly young man answers the door, and he spoke in Flemish, which I thought, oh dear. So I used my best schoolboy German and had the door slammed in my face, and I thought, now that is encouraging. He doesn't like the sound of German. And eventually I was in the kitchen, the general room of the farmhouse, with grandfather, grandmother, their daughter, a baby in her arms, and this young man who was her husband. And I discovered later that grandfather was the mayor of the village. And they took me in and looked after me, put me in an attic upstairs. I looked out of the window in September. It's the time when they have their annual fair, a kermis, and I watched a bicycle ride going by. And Angel told me later, she was the mother of the little lad, that they were at the fair and she's thinking to herself, oh goodness, what have we done? We have this man in our house. And they knew the penalties to be paid because notices had been posted that anybody found helping airmen would be, if a man shot and a woman sent off forced labour. So that they took an enormous risk in looking after me. And they held me there, and after a few days asked if I could ride a bicycle, and I went on a bicycle to the nearby town of Tienan, or Tillemont, and there I was at the house of Manny and Marcel. Marcel worked at the stock exchange in Brussels, and he was a big fella, and I was a lad of 19, and he gave me one of his suits, and the trousers came up to there, and you could peer down them, and the jacket, well, you could wrap it round yourself, but there wasn't a mark on it, a tailor's mark, a manufacturer, cleaner's mark, anything. It was absolutely clean. And he gave me a pair of shoes as well. From there, I went by tram into Brussels, and I was looked after there by Achille Eulieu, a former Belgian army officer who lived near Laeken, the royal palace, and there's a pagoda there. And Achille and I went to this pagoda one day, and we're having a look around inside, as we might be with this table in front of us, at various things on the table. And on the other side of the table, as close as you are there, was a German army major looking into it. So I had a good look, he had a good look, and Achille was standing in the corner. And when we got home, he said, oh, Bob, if he'd only known. But he was a lovely lad, Achille. And I stayed there, and I was given a false identity, a Belgian seaman up from Bordeaux visiting my mother in Brussels in Sluizenstraat, and 19 Sluizenstraat was where I lived, but if the Germans had gone there, there wasn't a number 19. And the care and attention that the line took in safeguarding not only us but other people as well, so that nobody could go knocking on their door and say that we have got this fella and his address is your house. That house just didn't exist. And there I was with a false identity, and I was taken to the flat of two sisters in war, not blood sisters, but sisters in war. And one of them came in with a shopping bag which she put on the table, and it fell open, and out came a photograph, a small identity card size photograph, and it was Del Mounts. And I said, I recognised that chappie. And there was a look of, relief on the faces of these two ladies. they'd arranged this thing because our stories seemed improbable to them. Dell, an American in the Canadian Air Force, flying with the RAF, didn't know very much about it. It was his first trip. And I, speaking German, they thought that we were being infiltrated to find our way through the line. So they matched our stories up, and a few days later Dellen and I are greeting each other and saying, "Hello, how did you get on?" Because when we jumped out, we covered a radius of some 25 miles between us. We put it all together afterwards. And a few days later, we met Bill Randall, the pilot. He'd been fed into this line, the Comète Line, and that line saved 800 of us. The remarkable thing to me about it now is that at the time, we were obviously operating. We'd done a fair number of operations, and I'd been through the London Blitz, so bombing and bangs and one thing and the other had become, as it were, something that you had to endure. Coming down on the parachute, there was no hesitation about leaving the aircraft. I knew that it wasn't flying anywhere. It was in bits and pieces. And I saw it hit the ground and I thought, there, no other blighter's going to fly you, Zebra. And I came down through this cloud, and then I thought, Friday night, my leave, that's gone. And I was absolutely round off at that point. I really was. And so when I hit the ground, I was spitting with fury at having lost my leave, as I thought. That was the thing there. And I did have, and this is the point I think, a plan in mind, what I was going to do. I knew this. Now, having been in Germany before the war, I was not unaccustomed to being on the continent. I had done quite a lot of solo camping on my own in this country. I'd been part of the Scout movement, and the camping had developed naturally from there. And as a young lad, I had a bivvy tent, my bicycle, and I would go off, usually with a chum, Bob Johnston. And we were accustomed to looking after ourselves at that point. So I wasn't totally unprepared. And I thank the Scout movement very much for giving me a lot of background and finding my way about at night. Yes, it helped a lot. I remember some of the night treasure hunts we had as scouts.
And I mean, did you have any idea where you landed when you came down?
We only knew that we were east of Brussels and somewhere in Belgium. The navigation at that point was a bit haywire. Well, the aircraft had been limping about a bit, and Scotty was a damn good navigator, and the best he could come up with, well, we're not going to make the coast, here we are, and that's it. And when we left the aircraft, we were, as far as we knew, all in one piece, each and every one of us, which was a miracle. And we're one of the very few crews in Bomber Command to survive completely as a crew, and all except one escape. The one who didn't escape gave himself up rather than have reprisals carried out against the village, because somebody in that village had gone to the Germans and said, there's a chappie holed up here. And the mayor of the village went to the house where Norman was, Norman, a Canadian. It was the house of the schoolmaster, and they said, we can't help you, but we will give you food and clothing and set you on your way. And Norman said, no, what happens to you people? And they said, well, that's up to us. He said, no, it isn't. I'm going out exactly as I came in, which he did, and he walked until he was found. Spent the rest of the war in Stalag Luft 8B.
So there was no connection with the village that he'd
No connection at all. Amazing. I found all that out 40-odd years later when we came together as a crew for the first time since bailing out at the opening of the Bomber Command Museum at Hendon in London.
I mean, it sounds a bit of a naive question, but what was the kind of atmosphere in the aircraft like immediately before you bailed out? I mean, was there any planning? You didn't obviously try and say, oh, we'll try and meet up on the ground.
No, absolutely none whatsoever.
So
No.
what was it like? I mean, how were you?
Well, between us, we were each trying to do the best we could with the aircraft in the state it was in. The wireless op, for example, was tearing up the psycho cards and things like that. The bomb aimer down at the front of the aircraft was doing his best to see anything that was ahead of us in any way whatsoever. The turrets weren't operating. There were no hydraulics because the port engine had been knocked out. And Bill just kept the aircraft going as best he could. And then it was okay. We, as a crew, came together very, very much whilst we were still at OTU. When one night we were returning on a navigational exercise and the port engine there packed up and the aircraft started to come, and Bill suggested that we bail out, and Walter, the front gunner, bomb aimer, said, no, don't do that, the ground's very close. So we all took up our crash positions and we hit a barn. The aircraft broke in two. Bill, the pilot, was unconscious, and Norman, the wireless op, went and got him out. The gun sight had come back and hit me and stunned me, and as I was falling out of the turret at the back, Scotty, the navigator, came down at the side to get me out, and it really gelled us together as a crew. We knew that in a tight spot, you've got some friends.
And was this the occasion when you had your dad's army experience then?
There we had our dad's army experience then. We got down behind a tree, a fallen tree, a trunk, and the aircraft's on fire, the ammunition is going off, and the first people to arrive actually were the local fire brigade. And at that point the oxygen bottle started to explode, and they asked what was that, and Norman said, they're bombs. So the fire brigade disappeared, very understandably. Then the local home guard arrived, and as I've said, we had to convince them that we were on their side, and all was well. So that was fine. Then an ambulance came from the local cottage hospital, and we were all in favour of going on it, except Bill, the pilot, who said, no, we'll wait for the RAF one to arrive, which it did, and we were taken to RAF Whitton, and I was taken into sick bay and sewn up. And when I came out, the rest of the crew were all looking very pleased with themselves. They'd all had a tot of rum. So I said, where's mine? Bob, you're the youngest member of the crew. We don't want to encourage you. The fact that we'd been out drinking whenever we possibly could was beside the point.
So whereabouts was it that you actually crash landed?
In Cambridgeshire, near to Whitton.
So you had to do some...
We went back there years later as a crew, and the farmer had retired and his son had taken on the farm. The son had a grandson to the farmer, the original farmer, this young lad, young, about 12 or so. And he looked at his grandfather and said, so it was true, Grandad, these men did come and knock your barn down. The parachute training at that time, and we're going back to early on in the war, we're talking here 1941, the end of 1941, early 42. It consisted quite simply of you jump out, count 3, pull the cord. And that was it. It was just as well because you weren't worried, am I doing the right thing or anything? By the time I hit the ground, I was so busy mumbling to myself that I was quite relaxed. I wasn't stiff or anything, and this field came up and hit me. Now, Bill, the pilot, he landed, his parachute got caught in a tree, and the buckle came up under his chin, like that. And he didn't know how high he was in this tree. So thinking, well, it's now or never, he managed to undo the buckle and fell about that much. Scotty, the navigator, wasn't so lucky. He hit a road and broke his legs, and, well, one leg, and hobbled until he met somebody. They took him in, looked after him, got a doctor, the leg was mended, and the next year, 1943, he came home by the Comète Line again. The other two lads, they landed at some distance. Norman, as I have said, was in a house and had to leave it because someone in the village had gone to the Germans. And Walter, the bomb aimer, he never found anyone to help him at all and walked all on his own for 6 months from Belgium to the French-Spanish frontier at the Mediterranean end. And by this time, a little group of vagabonds, you could say, were going together, all heading the same way. A couple of them, one was a Turk, and he lay down in the snow by Andorra and just died at the wayside. And when Walter eventually got to the frontier, he was arrested and put into Miranda del Ebro, and then released from there later on by a diplomatic thing and taken down to Gibraltar, a very sick man, and flown back to Canada. And when he was fully recovered, now over 9 months have gone by since he was reported missing, he went out to Moncton on the east coast of Canada, where he had left when coming over to Britain. He sailed over to Britain, and at Moncton he'd met in an army canteen there a young French-Canadian girl, and he went to find her, only to discover that she had joined the Canadian Army and was on embarkation leave to come over to Europe. So they went and saw her CO. Could you please stop the embarkation leave? And the CO said, no, it's not possible unless you're married. And in Walter's own words, we arranged that pretty damn quick. And they have 5 children and numerous grandchildren. We had what was known as an escape kit. It was a small packet. You carried this thing in the aircraft, and inside you had things like water purifying tablets, Horlicks tablets, a silk map, a certain amount of money, and a little box of matches, Swan Vestas matches. Now, there, Del Mounts, the American, it was his first trip, and he hadn't really investigated what was inside the escape kit. And he was the only one on board our aircraft who smoked. So when he landed, he took out his cigarettes and found he'd got one match. So he smoked all the cigarettes one after the other. Then he looked at the escape kit and found a box of matches.
Okay, so when you got to this first house, obviously great trepidation, but were those people actively helpers, or
now,
were you introduced to?
What happened there? This is now about 5 o'clock in the morning, and it's lightish, and there came a knock at the door, and the family, grandfather, grandmother, daughter, husband, baby, we're all in here together having this, trying to make each other understood. They were Flemish speaking, you see, so you've got to get round this language barrier somehow or the other. And the knock came at the door, and it was a woman. Now, every place in the world has one of these. She knows everything that's going on. And she had obviously seen me creeping round the village, and she came knocking at that hour of the morning for some meat, because they were also the family, the village butchers. So they gave her a packet of meat, and off she went. And I discovered long afterwards that she was visited by the local resistance and told to keep quiet, which she did, fortunately. The family itself, grandfather, and I discovered this years and years later, was the mayor of the village, and he was a member of the local White Army. And they got together and said, we have this airman. Now, they were suspicious of me because I had been using German. And they had a discussion what to do with me. The leader of that particular group said, don't kill him. If he is an agent, then he's worth more alive to us than dead. We can extract information from him. So they kept me alive. And when I went from that village to Tierlemont on the bicycle, I discovered later there was a man behind me with a revolver, and if I'd made any untoward move, he had orders to stop me. And that was how I arrived at Tierlemont, and I found all that out afterwards. Now, they fed me through to Marcel and Manny Reynerts, and they were the beginning of what became known as the Comète Line at that point. They were acting as feeders to it. And when I got to Brussels, and I was given my false identity and so on, I met Dédée de Jongh. Now, she started what became known as the Comète Line way back in 1940. There were men who hadn't got out at the time of Dunkirk. They had to come back inland and try and escape that way. She was looking after 3 soldiers. They were also looking after Belgians who were wanted for one thing or another. And so she decided to set up a line to get these people out. And she had a friend, Arnold de P, a Belgian businessman, who had been in the International Brigade in Spain during the Spanish Civil War and knew something about that end of the continent there. And between them, they started by sending off some Belgians who knew all the ways to behave. For example, going to the lavatory, you put something in the little dish for the concierge. You don't call attention to yourself by not doing it. You know the way to look when you're crossing the road. You know the way to put your knife and fork on the plate when you've finished a meal. All of those everyday things. Now, those men went down and they disappeared and nothing was ever heard again. They passed into oblivion, but they never ever spoke because there were no repercussions at all. So the next thing, Dédée de Jongh sends and takes 3 of these men, Scottish Highlanders, the regiment, down to San Sebastian. They've managed to find a Basque guide to get them over the Pyrenees, and at that end of the line there was another Belgian lady, Madame de Greff, with her husband, son and daughter. They had tried to get across to England at the time of Dunkirk but couldn't, and so they had gone down through France and finished up at St Jean de Luz on the other side of Bayonne, and they squatted in a house, and they became the anchor group at that end of the line, receiving whoever came down and passed them on over the mountains. And her daughter, Janine, who was 17 at the time, took 5 of us from Paris to St Jean de Luz overnight in the train. And whilst going down, the trains were, as all trains were, absolutely crowded, people standing in the corridor. It didn't have a central corridor, the side corridor in those days. And Dell, the American, he'd been dozing and he looked up and saw a woman standing in the corridor. He opened the door of the compartment. "Say, ma'am, would you like my seat?" She said, "Thank you," and sat down, and Dell stood in the corridor. And we waited for all hell to break loose, and I looked across and there was Janine sat in the corner, didn't turn a hair. Nothing was said, nothing ever happened. And she is still alive, she lives in Brussels. Her mother, Tango, got the George Medal.
You said this chap followed you at a distance because they didn't trust you at that point.
At that point, they didn't.
But I mean, in those early stages, were you having to make your own way, in theory, on your own, or were you escorted?
No, you're escorted every inch of the way. Once you were in the line, became known as the Comète Line, you were absolutely taken care of. You didn't go through the usual thing of number, rank and name. If they wanted to know anything, you told them. You didn't try and avoid anything at all. You put your life entirely in their hands, and by the same token, they put their lives in our hands, so that if we had been caught, the chances were that it would be hard for them. And I was asked, if you're caught, could you please try and say nothing for 24 hours to incriminate us, to give us chance to get out of the way? Later on, in 1943, Dédée de Jongh was arrested at the farmhouse at the foothills of the Pyrenees, and with her was another airman, Stan Hope, and he was arrested. And he described Dédé's actions at that point as being utterly fearless, and she made a mockery of the people who were her captors. He was interrogated for over 100 days, and he did see Dédé at Bordeaux, where they had been taken to a prison, and she looked at him and nodded. He had a rather bruised face by this time, and then he was put into POW camp. Dédée de Jongh, the Germans didn't accept that such a young woman could be the head of a line of people doing this work. And she was sent to a concentration camp, and she swapped places with a dead person and lost herself in the crowd at the concentration camp. She survived, finished her nurse's training, went out to the Belgian Congo and then to Senegal and to Ethiopia nursing lepers. And she spent 30 years of her life doing that. And for her work during the war and for her nursing of lepers, the King of the Belgians created her a countess. And she died just a little while ago this year, at the end of July. And we had visited her just before then, because the RAF did what is known as a staff ride following the Comète Line from Brussels to San Sebastian in Spain. And whilst we were in Brussels, a little group of us went to visit Dédée de Jongh, and Squadron leader Al Green took her a cup, a saucer and a tea plate, all with the RAF monogram on them. And they wore their uniforms, and she was absolutely delighted that the RAF still remembered her.
And she survived by taking on somebody else's identity?
Yes, lost herself. Yeah, truly remarkable. The great thing about the Comète Line was that it was set up independently by Dédée de Jongh. When she was interviewed by the consulate at Bilbao, she told them that she wanted to keep control of that line. She was not going to be taken over by anybody. It was a Belgian-inspired line. It would remain that, and it kept its independence and only ceased to exist a few years ago. It became a self-help organisation. So many of the resistance groups during the war didn't last. That they were founded politically and for various other reasons. The Comète Line, its proud boast was, without firing a shot, it never had a gun at all, it tied down a battalion of Germans looking for airmen before the Comète Line got to them and spirited them away. They're absolutely splendid bunch.
And at what point in the early part of the time after you parachuted, did you realise? Did it start to dawn on you that this was actually quite organised? Actually,
the actual organisation as such, whatever panics they had, and they must have had quite a few, they never communicated them to us. As I say, with Achille in Brussels, we were walking about trying to look as normal and as natural as possible. They did warn me, Achille warned me, that the local people in crowded places like railway stations or on trams or things like that would brush against the German soldiers, and if they could steal anything from them, they would do. If they could steal a soldier's pocketbook, his army pocketbook, that soldier was in trouble. So they were doing something. If he was an officer and carried a little revolver, if they could steal that, they did. The garage of Achille's house had been sandbagged at the back and was a shooting range where they tried out whatever they'd managed to steal. They were there. But he said, be prepared to be searched. And we were on a tram in Brussels. The tram was stopped and we were turned out and lined up against the side of the tram and searched over. And I knew why that was happening. They were searching me to see if I had stolen anything from the Germans. So forearmed, forewarned and all that, you know. They were also looking to see if I was a Jew and not wearing my Star of David. And if that had been the case, I was due for a good kicking there and then on the spot. When we came between Belgium and France, going from Brussels to Paris, unusually, I was taken by Achille. Now, he was the keeper of a safe house, and normally safe house keepers did not act as couriers, but for some reason or other, he had to act as my courier, taking me from Brussels to Paris. At the frontier, the train was stopped. We were ordered off whilst the train was being searched, and we were sent through a hall where we had to produce our identity card and so on. And by this time I had a little suitcase with a razor and so on. I felt a bona fide traveller. And I showed up my false papers. All was accepted. And I'm standing there and a German soldier points his rifle at me, hand a hoch, and I'm like that. And then he starts patting me over. And I thought, I know why this is, what this is. Achille, who was standing off to one side, came over. Now, he spoke fluent German and spoke to that guard. He's a gormless-looking so-and-so, isn't he? And the German, I think, was flattered to think that somebody was talking to him, because normally, you know, not quite. And he didn't see these trousers, which were 10 sizes too big for me. The care the people in the line took of us, absolutely fantastic. You've never had a better travel service in all your life. After the war, after the liberation that is, I was taken back by the RAF sorting out sheep from goats, who wasn't a helper and who wasn't one thing and the other. And I was able to introduce the people in Tienen to the people in Capellen. Oh, hello. So that's where you went, Bob. Yes, that's where I went. They did have this series of cutouts. The Comète Line itself lost 216 members shot or otherwise killed. Over 1,000 of them were in camps, prisons, at the time of the liberation. They saved over 800 Allied aircrew, as well as a number of civilian people as well. A man who looked after me in Paris, Robert Eiley, he and his wife, they lived near to the tomb of Napoleon, Les Invalides, in the Rue de Babylon, at the top floor of a little apartment block. And Robert and his wife Germaine were third order Dominicans, and their priest, who had become a member of the Comète Line, invited them to become safe house keepers, and their apartment became a safe house. Now, you were invited. People who volunteered for the line were not accepted, because anybody could have volunteered. So they invited people. I was there in 42. In 43, Robert was arrested and he was executed in 44. Germaine went looking for him when he didn't come home, and when she got back to the apartment, she was arrested, and the Germans said, "We're sending you to forced labour," and she refused to do forced labour for them, so they sent her to Mauthausen, the concentration camp. She survived, became aunt to my children, lived to be 90. But what that woman had to do after the liberation, to go home from a concentration camp to her flat, which had been turned over by the Germans and then padlocked shut, she had to clean and clear all that lot up before she could begin living her life. Now, fortunately, the priest who had invited her and Robert to become safe housekeepers for the Comète Line had secured the body of Robert, and that was in a cemetery at Ivry in the south of Paris. After the war, I went to work for the United Nations Educational Organization, UNESCO, and we were eventually based in Paris. And I went to see Germaine, and it took several years before Daphne, my wife, and I were able to talk with her about what had happened to Robert and so on. She had got his body put into a military section of the cemetery at Ivry, so that it will always be looked after, rather like our own War Graves Commission. And she gave her body to science. They had no children, no other family immediate. And she died at 90. I had received a telephone call early in November of that year that she was gravely ill, and Daphne and I took off straight away and drove to Paris, and unfortunately we arrived half an hour after she died. So we stayed for a little bit and then went back for the memorial service, and I was given her 2 Bibles. As I said, they were third order Dominicans.
Was that one of the first things that you entered in your mind when you landed? God, how near are the Germans?
No. My main thing was to make off in a southwesterly direction. It was when I was with the first family, the Van Gilbergens, that I discovered the curfew. We didn't have a curfew at all. Now, every evening at 8 o'clock, you were indoors and you didn't go out until 5 in the morning. And if you were found on the streets, you were questioned, and anything could have happened to you. So this idea that you only travelled overnight and things like that just didn't obtain. It was, we thought, too dangerous to travel at night on your own in open countryside. You were breaking the curfew. The language barrier, it's surprising what you can do without talking. Now, I got the identity card photograph in a department store in Brussels. I was given the money, told exactly what to do, which is rather like what you do now. You go into a little booth, draw the curtain, follow the instructions. But I'd been told the instructions, you wait a bit, out comes the picture and out you go. So I had me a photograph. Years later in the Air Force, we had our photographs taken and we carried them with us so that we were all ready. But way back in 42, that hadn't advanced that far. You can do all sorts of things, and nowadays in a supermarket you don't have to say a word. You just go along, take what you want, and as long as you've got some money, there you are. Surprising what you can do without talking.
So the fact that your only foreign language was German, and that wasn't going to go down too well with anybody. I mean, you were. How did you feel? Did you feel panicky that you might think, oh my gosh, I might have to?
No, I was absolutely intent upon getting home. The thought of going into a prison camp to me was utterly wrong. I couldn't bear to be locked up. The feeling I had then I still have now. And that I was coming home, the people around me were acting normally, so the thing to do is to act normally and just try and do the best you can. And keep a low key. Don't try any heroics or anything at all like that. Be as calm and as quiet as you possibly can. And the fact that I would go out and about with them, we walked about in Paris. We went along the Champs-Élysées. Certain cinemas, cafes and places like that, Germans only. You can't go in there. You stand off the pavement and let the German walk by. You don't try and, push him about. And Robert told me as we were walking along the Champs-Élysées that the Germans did used to hold a military parade along the Champs-Élysées up towards the Arc de Triomphe every day, until along came a fighter aircraft and shot up the German parade. So they abandoned it, and the local people were absolutely delighted about that. Many, many years later, at a dinner given by the RAF Escaping Society, I met the pilot of that aeroplane. I got him to sign the menu, and I sent it over to Germain. Here's the chap that Robert was telling me about. We went from Brussels to Paris by train. Achille took me there. On arrival at Paris, we went to a church, and I was told, well, you sit down here and you wait until somebody comes and sits in front of you, and they will carry a newspaper under their left arm. That was the identification. And when they get up and go, just follow them. And I never saw Achille again until after the liberation. He just went off, and so I was handed over from one to the other. Who the other person was, I haven't got the faintest idea. And in Paris, I was taken to the flat of Robert and Germain up on the top floor, and I slept on a settee there. It was a diminutive flat, it really was. The bedroom of Robert and Germain, it was in an L-shaped apartment, looked out across to the entrance to the apartment. You could actually see their front door from their bedroom window. And Robert had gone away. He'd gone to Normandy. And a knock came at the door. Germaine looked across to the entranceway when the knock had come, and she saw this fellow standing there with a uniform, had a swastika and all, and she wasn't too happy about this. So what do? How do you hide yourself? You're at the top of a block of flats. It was only 4 stories high. And I'm looking out of the window and thinking, well, if I can get out on there, I could hang on there. And if someone does come racketing about through the flat, they won't, I hope, find me. And then I'll get back into the flat and we'll be all right. But fortunately, at that point, Germaine came in and she said, it's all right. He was a postman. They've given them a new uniform and he was delivering a registered letter. And that was why he was knocking on the door. But what do you do at that point? Now, as far as we were concerned, had we been arrested, we could claim the protection of the military and go into a POW camp. those people being arrested had no protection whatsoever. When we got home after an operation, for example, we would be debriefed, have breakfast, go to bed. We were not waiting for a knock at the door. They were waiting for the knock at the door, not if it would come, but when it would come. And as I say, 216 of them were shot.
Yes,
so the price those people paid. When we got home, I could wear my uniform, I could go into the pub or into the shop in uniform. Oh, hello lad, would you like a pint? Things like that. It happened. But as far as they were concerned, they were just to be as absolutely normal as possible. Not a word to anybody of the work they were doing or anything. You met a young grandson when you came in here. If they had children in the family, how did they manage to do what they did without the children picking it up? And then, as children do, oh, there was a man here yesterday, saying to their friends outside, and the word gets round and bang, their cover's blown. They had to work their way all around that. So we didn't meet very many children actually in the line. Where you would have met them was at the point of contact, which could have been anywhere, usually in the countryside after your aircraft had crashed. And then they fed you into the line. Going back after the liberation, who was there and who was not? And it was for them a thing they called the long silence. When Germain and Robert had been arrested, nobody could go along and say, please, what have you done with them? You just kept away. It wasn't until the liberation. Have they survived? Will they come home? It was a terrible, terrible time.
Yes, I mean, they were just risking, well, they were living double lives.
The long silence.
When they were living a double life.
Yes.
And also, they couldn't obviously tell people they were presenting one
They
life.
couldn't do a damn thing at all. It wasn't until after the war. And then I discovered many, many years later, the woman in that Belgian village who had gone to the Germans and said there's an airman holed up in the village somewhere, her house caught fire. There were scores to be settled. Oh, yes.
But they were risking so much. Because
they risked absolutely everything, absolutely. And they did this. They didn't have any training at all in undercover work. This was done completely off their own on their own initiative. And I think it's one of the reasons why they were so successful, because the Germans could not understand how a bunch of civilians, mainly women, were doing this. It's not possible. You've got to have training and all this, that and the other, to it. And so they survived.
If people have any awareness these days of what the occupied countries did during the war, it's always France, France, France. Very little attention gets paid to Belgium and the Belgian people.
Similarly in Italy as well. The Italian people over on the Adriatic side of Italy, the Apennines, up north there was POW camps, and lads were trickling out of there, coming down after the invasion from the south of Italy, and people along the way were helping them. And the Germans arrested a whole lot in a church, and every day they threw one of them off from the top of the church. It was a warning to everyone else not to help Allied people coming home. So in Italy, we don't always think of Italians as being helpful in that way, but by golly, they did as well. And in so many different countries in Europe, there's help that was being afforded to people. There's
at such great risk to the people.
Absolutely great risk to themselves, and not only to themselves but to their families. Am I prepared to do this work knowing that I'm putting my whole family in jeopardy? It's an enormous decision to take, and I do not hold it against anybody for saying, I'm sorry, but that's a risk I cannot accept. Those who did accept it were exceptional people. And M.R.D. Foote, the historian, he says of Dédée de Jongh that among these exceptional people, she was exceptional. There was a series in 1960 on the BBC radio, Men of Courage, Brian Horrocks. One of the subjects was a woman, Dédée de Jongh. And at the end of his programme about the Comète Line, he says of Dédée de Jongh, when she went to the Congo, in her luggage was an evening gown. Can you imagine taking an evening gown to the Congo to work as a nurse among lepers? Tells you a lot about the woman. The White Army, Grandad belonged to the White Army. This was a secret army of people who were resistant to the occupation force. You can now go and see little memorials to them where they were executed and things like that. Now, Grandad did belong to that. He was the mayor of the village, but his sympathies were entirely with a free Belgium. They were doing this to free their country. And the fact that we were going over nightly was a ginormous encouragement to them. It really was. I've had this said time and time again to me. Bob, we hear you at night, and we know that all is going on. We are not lost. So people who denigrate the offensive forget the huge morale lift that it gave to the people of the occupied countries, that all was not lost.
Well, and he was referring to hearing the aircraft.
Yes,
going
yes.
Yeah, as you say, yes, a great morale lifter, and that obviously inspired them to help.
The most frequent question I was asked, and this was in 1942, Bob, when is the liberation coming? It took a long time, didn't it? But it did come.
Paris again on the train, and was that pretty well one straight run to the Spanish border?
Down to the Spanish border, yes, that was one straight run. Then we were taken off the train at St Jean de Luz, and from there straight away to a farmhouse in the foothills of the Pyrenees, just beyond a place called Biddiganberry farmhouse. And that was the starting off point for crossing the Pyrenees. And there were 5 of us. Bill Randall, the pilot, we'd met up with him in Brussels. Del Mounts, our second pilot there, Teddy Bradshaw, an Englishman, and Teddy Frankowski, a Pole, who was in the Polish Air Force making his way home. And we met again with Dédée de Jongh, and I sat on the back step of that farmhouse in the evening talking with Dédée, and I sensed the difficulty and the danger of the task she was doing. I was going home to freedom. She was going to be staying there. And I asked her, why Dédée, why do you do this? And she said very simply, because it's there to be done. We were given these espadrille, rope-soled shoes, and a stout stick. We hung our shoes tied by the laces round our neck, and we set off to cross the Pyrenees. The leader was Florentino Gaicachia, a Basque, a mountain guide. He had no other language than Basque, and he knew every inch of those mountains because his job was a smuggler. He was a professional smuggler. And the 5 followed him, and then behind us was Dédée de Jongh, and she carried a little rucksack with various things in it. And going up over the mountains, I fell into a large hole, and it totally took the breath out of me. Dédée, coming behind, saw what had happened, got the group stopped. Florentino came back, knelt down, reached into the hole and lifted me out like a drowned rat. There you are. And Dédée looked at me and made sure I was okay to go on. Her concern was, are you all right? And on we went. We eventually got to the river Bidassoa, and it was in flood, so we couldn't cross it. So we had another 5 hours walk up the river to a bridge. And there we had to wait, because at the top of the bridge was a guardhouse, and there was a Spanish guard up there, leaning on his rifle and smoking a cigarette. And when he moved off, we went one by one, shot across the road and up the hill on the other side. You were like mounting goats. You just didn't follow paths and think more that we knew. And we got over that way. Now, on the way over, Florentino had stopped from time to time and delved into a bush and brought out a bottle of cognac. And this was passed round, and we all had a swig, and then the bottle went back in, and on we went. An excellent way to cross the mountains. On the other side, we had to follow a railway track, and walking from sleeper to sleeper, because if your foot came off, you were on the ballast on the track, and through those espadrilles that was painful. But eventually we reached the other side. We handed in the stick, I suppose, but there was a car waiting to take us, and I was absolutely tickled pink. It was a Mercedes with CD plates on the back. And we went off, and Dédée de Jongh went on to see the vice-consul, and then back into France to carry on more work, until eventually in 1943 she was arrested. It was at that time the 19th time that she'd done that journey both ways, crossing the mountains. We were taken from there down to Madrid into the British Embassy, and what had been the stables of the embassy was turned into a barrack room, and there was half the Polish Air Force in there making their way over to this country. And we were given some money, and people in the embassy, the maids, would go out and come back with things for us, bananas and so on and so forth. And the shoes that I'd been given way back in Belgium by Marcel Reynertz, these were sent back. Just a pair of shoes, and when they arrived, he knew that I was safe. And I was given a pair by the Red Cross, very nice pair of shoes. When I wore them and it rained, they fell apart. They were made of genuine cardboard. But at least they did me until I got safely home. And at Gibraltar, we were taken onto the Rock. We were in a coach, and there was obviously a diplomatic arrangement. And then we were interrogated at Gibraltar, and we were there for a few days, and then flown home in a Dakota of the United States Air Force, or Army Air Corps. And it was jolly cold, because the aircraft had to fly way out to sea at the Bay of Biscay and keep well away from land in order to avoid fighters and so on. And we landed at Portreath in Cornwall 8.5 hours later, and they knew nothing about us whatsoever. So there's Dell, the American, Bill, pilot, myself. We managed to get some warm clothing because we were still in khaki shorts at this point. We'd been issued with at Gibraltar, and this time we're coming up to Christmas, so it was a bit cold. And we got £5, which was a lot of money, and a railway warrant, And we went on the train up to London. Bill was going to see his family. I was going to find mine. And Del reckoned he had some friends to visit. And we arranged to meet 3 days later outside a Dastral house in Kingsway, which we did. It was a bit of a surprise for my mother. She, at that time, was working as a cook with the London Fire Brigade at Clerkenwell, a super station in the Fire Brigade. My father was in the Air Force. He was on the reserve, and he was at North Devon, and had been taken. He and my mother had gone up to the squadron when they received the telegram saying that I was missing, and then there was no more news after that. And they'd gone up to where the squadron was, simply to find out what had happened to me. And also it so happened that my brother David, he's 15 years my junior, was evacuated near to there at Penistone. So they'd stayed with his family there and had gone across to the squadron to find out what had happened. My father was taken ill and put into a military hospital in Sheffield and had to be discharged on medical grounds from the RAF. I think the news that I was missing had hit Dad very hard. And I didn't realise the bond. Mum was delighted. My brother David, I brought some bananas back from Gib. He'd never seen a banana at all. And Mother put it there in front of him without peeling it. Well, he looked at it, wasn't very good to play with, had a smell at it. No, didn't think you could eat that or anything. And then Mother peeled back a bit of the banana and just took a little bite. And David's eyes opened wide. And after that, Bob, when are you going to bring me some more bananas?
Yeah. So how long did it take you from the moment you were shot down until you actually got back on?
5 weeks and 4 days. When we got to a Dastral house, they didn't know anything about us. And then we were taken to Marylebone railway station, the hotel of which was an MI9 headquarters at that time, and we were debriefed there. And then I went up to what I thought would be the squadron, only to find that the squadron was no longer there. In that short space of time, the squadron, what had been left of it, had actually been reformed and posted out to North Africa for the Italian campaign. So here I am back in this country, and what to do with me. And I was sent to an RAF Marine school up in Scotland near to Stranraer to teach the marine craft people how to look after the machine guns and so on that were there for the protection of the marine craft, the ASR vessels and all that sort of thing. And I spent a time up there doing that. Then I was posted down to Bridgnorth in Shropshire as an air gunnery instructor, and it was there that I met Daphne. This would have been the end of 43. We were married in 45, and we had a golden wedding. Unfortunately, she died about 12 years ago, motor neurone. The Escaping Society was formed immediately after the war in Paris between Lord Portal, who was the chief of the air staff, and Sir Basil Embry, as he became. Embry had been an escaper, and they formed the Royal Air Force's Escaping Society to say thank you to the people who helped us. And we did that for 50 years until 1995, when the society disbanded, but the charitable fund continued until 2000, when we finally wound that up, dispersing whatever money we had to various organisations over Europe who had helped Allied airmen return home. One of the things we did every year was to bring over a party of people from the different helper countries and entertain them for a fortnight in London. And Bill had stayed on in the Air Force and became CO of a helicopter squadron at Odium. And one of the things was to take these people to Odium, and they all had a flight in a helicopter, which was rather nice. We enjoyed saying thank you to them. And every Christmas, we'd send a Christmas card just to let them know that we hadn't forgotten.
And wasn't there a scheme whereby money was raised to help children of these families as well?
We did that. Bill worked as a fundraiser. That's what he became after he left the RAF. First day covers, and he raised literally hundreds of thousands of pounds. And we all did our own bit. We gave talks and things like that to raise money. People left us money in their wills and so on, you know. And we did what we could to say thank you. I was fortunate enough to serve on the committee for 27 years. And during that time, we provide anything from a set of false teeth to a new fireplace for people who needed help. But the main thing for them all was the recognition that we hadn't forgotten them, that they were remembered. I was at the flat of Germaine and Robert in Paris, and I spent a few days there. During the time that I was there, we did visit one or two addresses in Paris where members of the line were living in order to make the arrangements for going southward. And we were advised about the railway station again, what you do and what you don't do and things like that. And we set out overnight on the train. We didn't have couchettes or anything at all. You just sat up overnight. And during the wartime, you were accustomed to travelling as best you could. So there was no hardship there at all. And then early in the morning, we arrived at St Jean, and we were taken straight to the farmhouse at Biddiganbury and waited up there. It was a very ordinary farmhouse in those days, and there were no buildings around it. Now, we've been back there quite a few times since, and the farmhouse is now a very white-painted dwelling, and there are houses grown up all around it as things have changed over the years. But the route over the Pyrenees is still walked every year by a group of people known as the World War II Escape Lines Memorial Society. They run 10 different routes throughout Europe where folk have made their way home. And one of those routes is the crossing of the Pyrenees. Every September we go back. Fortunately, I had a job, a school teacher, where I had a long summer holiday. So we invested in a caravan and travelled across to Belgium. I live near to Dover, so that wasn't a difficulty. See the family there, visit Germaine in Paris, and then set off to wherever our holiday was going to be that year. So we've seen them year on year. Grandfather, grandmother, the daughter and her husband have all died. The little baby is now grandfather to the family. He has 2 sons. One son has 2 sons, and the other son has 1 son. And they're all part of our family. They came over to this country at different times, and we've been over to stay with them. It's become a yearly visiting thing as they go along. Germaine and Robert, well, Robert was executed, as you know. Germaine lived to be 90. Manny and Marcel moved from Tierlemont into closer to Brussels, and they're both dead. Janine, who guided us, she still lives in Brussels. Her mother was given the George Medal, as was Dédée de Jongh, and also another person, Michu Ujo, who was one of the founder members of the line, and the George Medal was the highest award this country could possibly give them as civilians of another country. Achille, his girl, who was only a child at the time in 42, she became an airlines hostess for Sabina, and we looked after her for a time in London and visited them in Brussels. They still lived in the same house, and she died about 2 years ago, and the house is no longer occupied by the same family.
So when did you first go back to Belgium after the war?
1946. We had the end of the war ourselves. The liberation had come, and at the beginning of 46 I was flown back to Belgium to meet these people and to have the pleasure of introducing some ones to another at that point. So that was rather a nice thing. 45, the Escaping Society was formed in Paris, and when I was demobbed from the Air Force, I went to work for the United Nations, their preparatory commission in London, UNESCO, and then we moved across to Paris. So we were able to go and see Germaine. She was in a very frail condition at that point, she really was. And she spent the rest of her life looking after survivors of the concentration camps. Remarkable people. They've changed the course of my life totally and utterly. If that group hadn't helped me get home, I would never have met Daphne and things like that. I was destined to work at the Royal Veterinary College. I might have finished up looking after animals and not children. The line survived because it remained and kept its independence. It looked after itself after the war. We fed them money to do that sort of work, but once a month they would have a meeting in the Belgian Aero Club in Brussels, just as a get-together, have a cup of coffee and that sort of thing. Who needs help? What can we do for somebody? They really are the most caring group of people you could wish to meet. The RAF Escaping Society closed in 95. Just around that time, Roger Stanton, a soldier, started up what has become the World War II Escape Lines Memorial Society, ELMS, and they have these 10 routes running over Europe. And they carry on doing very largely the work that we were doing, but they've extended it further, and this is the thing that we love about it, that in these walks they bring in younger people. Anybody over the age of 18 can go on them if they're fit enough, and they take out the right insurance and that sort of thing, and can give up a week of their time and pay their own expenses, and they can follow these trails that were set up during the war. And we hope that that will go on. And already we have people coming from various countries and mixing together as well. And we think that mixing together is better than fighting together.
It wasn't just you and your courier. I mean, there were several of you.
There were 5 of us.
Yeah. And
Bill, Del, Teddy Frankowski, Teddy Bradshaw and myself.
Can you just describe how you sort of met up before you got on the train? And
we were in different places in Paris. We weren't all in the same house. We were in, I don't know where they were. You didn't ask. You didn't want to know. You didn't need to know. And we met at the railway station. That blonde girl over there, she's your courier. Just follow. Not too close. And then you followed. And when she got on the train, you'd all got your own tickets. That was all done for you. And the great thing is we were never, ever asked for anything. They never asked us for anything at all. Everything they somehow or other provided. And when you think about wartime restrictions of food rationing and things like that, I think there's a reason why they got me home so quickly. I was eating like a 19-year-old lad. Get the boy back to England out of the way. They didn't ask us for a farthing, and it's one of the things which has been an unwritten law with the Escaping Society. We raised money. We never, ever asked for anything ourselves. We always did it.
And how long did the crossing over the Pyrenees actually take from when you left the safe house?
It took us one afternoon until the following afternoon. As I say, we had to walk for another 5 hours because the river Bidassoa was in flood. Florentino, he was invited over to this country to receive his decoration, and a report had to be filled in for this citation, and there was the case of profession. So what was written on it? Smuggler? No, you couldn't put that down. Importer, exporter. And that's how he's described. He didn't like Buckingham Palace at all because he had to wear a collar and tie, and he'd never worn one in his life before. And he didn't like drinking wine out of a glass. He was more accustomed to having it in a skin.
What medal did he receive from the Queen?
The George Medal.
And what year would that have been?
46.
Oh, it wasn't the Queen then.
It was the king in those days. Now, when Dédée de Jongh and Nadine were released from the concentration camp, they were looked after in the hospital Brugman in Brussels by a British Army, Queen Alexandra's nursing corps nurse. And she didn't know who they were, anything about them at all, other than the fact that they had come out of a concentration camp. She was surprised at the number of RAF officers who were visiting and talking with them. Before she left there, Dédée gave her a piece of paper with her address in Brussels. And Nora Thornburn, the nurse, put the paper in her pocket, came back to this country. 1946, she's reading an account in the Telegraph or the Times, an investiture at Buckingham Palace. And then she realised who her charges had been. She married a British Army soldier, the classic case, nurse and soldier. He was wounded on the beaches in Normandy, Ned, and they had a daughter who went eventually to study at the Conservatory of Music in Brussels. So Ned and Nora go across to visit their daughter. Nora remembers that she's got that piece of paper with an address on it. So she looks up this piece of paper. They go to the address, and lo and behold, Dédée de Jongh is living there. She's now retired from her nursing and so on. And they become great friends over again. The daughter still lives and works in Brussels, and at the reunion she plays the organ in the Basilica at Kokelberg. Or she will sing, and she plays a little drum as well, the Song of the Partisans, things like that. She's got a lovely voice. Ned has died, and his wife Nora, she's in a nursing home up in Shropshire, and the daughter lives on in Brussels, singing over there, and we meet her on an annual basis.
Was the investiture for your smuggler, not your smuggler, your importer, exporter, and Dédée, was that the same investiture, or was it?
That was at the same one. At that particular moment, I wasn't in this country. I was working in Paris for UNESCO. But we did meet later again for a specific function when the three of them, the three George medalists, the ladies were invited over to this country. That would have been in the 1960s. And we looked after them again for a time and took them also to a garden party as our guests of honour there. It so happened then that the chief of the president of the Royal Air Force's Escaping Society by this time was Bob Hodges, Sir Lewis Hodges, and he had been ADC to the Queen, and so we took them through the palace on a very nice way, entering from the back of the palace and walking across the grounds. It was very nice for them.
One thing I didn't ask you was before this mission that you obviously shot down, but how many missions had you flown before that?
28.
That was pretty well the same crew?
It was the same crew all the while. We met together at Chipping Warden in Oxfordshire at an OTU there. We crashed an aircraft there, and after that crash we realised that we were a crew. We could rely upon each other to help out, and I think it welded us together as a crew. Now, from the time of bailing out in September 42 until the opening of Bomber Command Museum, I think that was 1980 something, we hadn't actually come together as a crew. Bill has retired from the Air Force. He retired as a group captain, and he went to work at the RAF Museum Hendon. And so when the Bomber Command Museum was open, he called the crew together, and even Dell from America. We found out, we knew where Dell had lived, Beulah in North Dakota, and I wrote to the mayor of Beulah, could you please help me find Dell Mounts? And I received a letter back from the lignite capital of the world. Yes, we knew Dell's father. He was in our Chamber of Commerce. Dell is now retired, living in San Diego. Dell had joined the United States Navy Air Corps, and he retired as a commander to San Diego. So he and his wife came over for the opening of Bomber Command Museum. So there's a lot of security because the Queen Mother was going to perform the opening, and there's Dell's wife, and my wife Daphne was there, and there was some difficulty because of the security. Could they be admitted? And Bill went off and came back with a big smile on his face. He says, yes, of course they can be admitted. I've just enrolled them as cleaners in the museum. And so we were there all together for the first time in goodness knows how many years. Now that really was an experience at the entrance to the museum and seeing these two lads I hadn't seen since we had bailed out coming in. That was quite a stunning experience. That really, really was. We did go over to Canada and visit them. I've been a couple of times to visit them. Unfortunately, Norman died this year. He was moaning he was no longer able to go curling in the winter. His knees had packed up. But he was a lovely lad.
Oh, I was just thinking back to sort of so many missions though, when the odds were so bad for crews. You must have thought you were. I mean, did you have a bit of a feel that you had a bit of a charmed?
Do you know what they called our aircraft, the ground staff? Boomerang. She kept coming back. Yes, this crew is one of the very, very few crews of Bomber Command to have survived being shot down, and out of the then 6 of us, 5 of us got back. Norman, as I say, was in a POW camp. So very often when an aircraft gets shot down, you're either dead or alive. It's not wounded. I mean, soldiers get shot. For every soldier you hear who's killed, there's at least half a dozen who've been badly wounded or one thing or another. In Bomber Command, the aircraft was hit and half the crew were killed immediately. So to survive was utterly remarkable. It really, really, really was. If I could meet the anti-aircraft crews who managed to hit the aircraft but not the crew, I'd say thank you. So we are one of the very, very few crews. Unfortunately, 3 of us have gone on, but I'd love the story to be told of the crew. We did survive. We bailed out. We had practiced bailing out. We knew the drill and that, because remember, we had crashed before. So it wasn't entirely new ground to us. And the way that we did it, Bill and I, we spoke back in London, because Scotty didn't come back at that time with us in 42. He'd broken his leg and had to be patched up and came back in 43. Walter was making his long journey all on his own, and Norman was in POW camp. So there's only Bill and I. Del had gone back to America and didn't know anything of our crew anyways. Bill arranged to go and see Scotty's side, and I contacted Wally Dreschler's family in Canada to say that when we had bailed out, Walter was alive and in one piece, and as far as I knew, was absolutely all right. But we heard no more from Walter for the next, must have been 7 months before any news came through. Yes, he's at Gibraltar, you see. Norman, we knew, POW camp, because that had come through via the Red Cross, I think, and we knew Del was all right. Scotty, well, he came back in 43, so that accounted for Scotty. And then we did, from time to time, Bill, Scotty and I meet up in London, because we were at different RAF camps, and have a little reunion of our own together. And we've just kept in touch all the way through ever since then. Born in London, in Camden Town, 1923, went to the